healthcare programs ballooned the size of government. Last month, it would have been 2 months ago now, Rand Paul shook the Republican establishment with a 13-hour filibuster over drones. Even the conservative Heritage Foundation, which often clashes with libertarians, tweeted, "Stand with Rand." That's making those inroads. The story continues. Lee Edwards of Heritage says libertarianism is having its moment. This is Lee Edwards, Heritage Foundation. Quote, "I think you'd have to go back to Barry Goldwater when he ran for president in 1964 to get somebody who advanced as many libertarian ideas and policies that are being talked about today." This is a Democrat, the same story, NPR, Tad Devine, a Democratic strategist, who says, quote, "These concerns have the potential of attracting voters. People could coalesce behind these concerns, vote for candidates that support an agenda, and this libertarian movement is becoming a place where a lot of these ideas are finding expression." That's the Democrats noticing this. All right, forget about this NPR story April 9th. This is a story this morning that I woke up and looked at. This is in the Politico. For many of you might know this, that Senator Paul was in Iowa last night. And the title of this Politico story is Rand Paul's Early State Mojo. And there were just two parts that sort of jumped out at me. This is the Politico. Quote, "As the GOP as a whole has inched in a libertarian direction, abandoning George W. Bush-style compassionate conservatism for a pure focus on small government." And then this is another passage from the Politico story this morning. Put simply, if you designed a candidate in a lab to match up with the early GOP primary states, it would probably look a lot like Rand Paul. Now, I want to put this thing down. I wanted to share that with you. That is just two examples of the stories we see over and over again that either the Republican Party is becoming more libertarian and needs to become more libertarian. We have so many opportunities. We could look at Tampa and what happened and all the nonsense that happened there. That was an establishment being scared of who we are and what we represent. Dr. Paul's rally, I think, there was the beginning of something. What Dr. Paul did when he ran for president in 2008 and 2012 is he kickstarted a movement that a lot of libertarians that have been around for a while could have never predicted it could have gotten so big. But it also reminded the Republican Party that we once were the party who preached what Barry Goldwater preached about small government. And that Reagan's promise of small government is how conservatives used to define themselves. Well, that's coming back, and it's thanks due mainly to the influence of libertarians. I think the Tea Party movement has a lot to do with that. You know, a lot of people say, well, this libertarian thing might be popular, it's a flash in the pan, but you guys don't line up with Republicans on foreign policy or civil liberties or maybe drug reform laws. Well, yeah, that's exactly the point why the Republicans can't make inroads into certain areas, because they don't line up with the American people anymore on foreign policy and civil liberties. It's the libertarian message that values the individual over the collective that can make inroads into the African American community, and they can speak to the Hispanic community as people, not a group. A lot of us believe that we shouldn't throw a young kid who made a mistake with drugs one time in jail for decades and decades, sometimes in sentences longer than rapists and murderers, where when they come out of jail, they're not only have their lives been destroyed because they've been next to these hardened criminals, but nobody will give them a job. They don't really have much of a future. I'm talking about 18 and 19-year-old kids who have no record. That's our mandatory minimum sentencing laws. When Senator Paul spoke at Howard University, there were some negative responses and there were some positive responses. But one of the overwhelmingly positive responses is when he talked about the need to get rid of mandatory minimum drug laws. Is that a conventionally Republican position? No, it's not. Is that a libertarian Republican position? Absolutely it is, and we can make inroads there. The NAACP president, Benjamin Jealous, wrote an op-ed at CNN, I believe 2 weeks ago, saying that Rand Paul was changing the direction of the Republican Party and going after that issue. He's even going farther than many Democrats. A lot of Democrats are not there yet. Speaking to the Hispanic community, we can talk to them in a different way than anybody else. For us as libertarian Republicans, the libertarian mindset, a lot of people, especially conventional Republicans, say, well, you guys just don't have a foreign policy that jives with the Republican Party. Well, in 2005, that was true. 2008, John McCain, that was probably true. I don't think that was even necessarily true in 2012 with Mitt Romney, even when Mitt Romney might have thought that was true. I don't think it's true now at all. If you look at the polling of Republicans, the majority of Republicans think we should have been out of Afghanistan a long time ago, but it's time to go on. More importantly than that, if you're talking about growing the Republican Party, which means going beyond the bounds of the current people who are registered Republican, the American people overwhelmingly agree with what Ron Paul was saying in 2008 and 2012 about foreign policy. They agree overwhelmingly with what Rand Paul has been saying about foreign policy, and Justin Amash and Thomas Massey, and basically any sane person who thinks after a decade and then some in Afghanistan, far too long in Iraq, that we should not have been there that long, and that we sure as hell don't need to start any more new interventions in Syria or Libya or anywhere else. We are on the majority side when it comes to foreign policy in this country. I'm talking about libertarian Republicans, not the conventional Republicans who said we don't belong, not the people within the Republican Party who say we're fringe. When it comes to foreign policy, the issue that they say disqualifies us, they are fringe. We are not. We're the majority. I think when it comes to attracting youth voters, which is something that no Republican can do for the most part, with the exception of libertarian Republicans. When you look at the polling for Ron Paul support, I think one of the most accurate polls had that 30% of his supporters were Democrats. Now, during the Republican primaries, a lot of other Republicans used that to beat him up. Look, all of his supporters are not, Republicans or conservatives. Well, that's a message that the rest of the Republican Party needs to look at in a positive way. How do you reach independents or people who might have voted for Barack Obama but are upset with what happened once he became president? How do you reach out with them? What was it about Ron Paul's message that made it possible for him to attract 30% of Democrats that in a way that Rick Santorum could never do, or Mitt Romney didn't necessarily do, or Newt Gingrich, or any of these other guys? I think that's something that's going to benefit any libertarian Republican moving forward. Also, when appealing to youth, I think for the first time in a long time, we see a rising generation that is not only more libertarian in its perspective, but there are certain attachments to the politics of old that maybe their parents and grandparents had that they do not. For example, I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with the fact that we have to do something about our broken entitlement system. It is a drain. It's the reason we have as much debt as we have. It's the reason we have, this exorbitant spending problem in Washington, D.C. Most young people, I'm 38 years old. People 10 years younger than me, hell, even me, I don't expect to see Social Security. I don't think it's going to be there. I'm surprised it's still there now. I don't know how to keep the trains running on time. A lot of young people are open to the idea of getting away from the old system, something that's far more fiscally solvent, not only for Washington, D.C., but for them personally, and looking at a new way of doing things. And our foreign policy. Most Americans are on our side, as I just said, but young people in particular can imagine in America where we have the strongest national defense, where nobody will mess with us, but that doesn't mean we have to police the world and be everywhere all the time. They're ready for that. They're also ready for how much less that will cost. On social issues, we hear a lot about that. Oh, libertarians, you're hedonists, and you're not really with us on the social issues. Actually, that's not true at all. I don't know how many of you from the last panel I moderated on faith and liberty. The most prominent libertarian voices out there today are devout Christians. Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Justin Amash, my friend Judge Andrew Napolitano. We need to let people know, especially people of faith, with large evangelical contingency within the Republican Party, that embracing liberty ideas or libertarianism does not mean rejecting your values. It means looking at what you think is important and those values in a different way. For example, can you change a nation of 300 million people into believing what Rick Santorum believes about gay marriage? From a political perspective, forget about your personal opinion, can you do that? I don't think you can. Can the states individually decide those things? I think they can. That's the constitutional position. I think many evangelical Christians within the Republican Party might like that idea better than some liberal president may be doing it the other way. The same goes for our drug laws. We regulate at the state level alcohol. That's the way the Constitution is set up. In fact, when we had at least a smidgen more honest government, when we prohibited alcohol, they were at least honest enough to pass an amendment to outlaw it. And then when they got rid of the prohibition, they passed another amendment to get rid of that. They don't even do that anymore. The federal war on drugs is completely unconstitutional, and it should be regulated at the state level. The same would go for the issue of life. I'm pro-life. It's one of my most important issues. It should be regulated at the state level. That's what overturning Roe versus Wade is all about. Those social issues are not about saying you're against traditional marriage, if you're an evangelical Christian within the Republican Party, or saying you're for drug use, or saying you're either pro-choice or pro-life. It's a different way of looking at those issues from what the conventional politicians have given us to this day. Well, I want to get to the Q&A portion of this and let you let's do some back and forth, which is always the most fun. But I do want to stress, all these things I've talked about here today and that will continue to be talked about throughout this convention, that people talk about, will the Republican Party grow? How will it survive? Will it be able to win elections nationally? Will it be able to govern nationally? Well, it has two paths. They can either become just like the Democrats, as many of the moderates think they should. They need to be more compromising and reach across the aisle. And at that point, they're going to lose. Why would you vote for a Republican Party that's just a lighter version of the other party? Or they have one other option, and there's not many. There's just one. They have to become a more libertarian Republican Party. We offer the message that no other Republican offer. We can attract independents, we can attract youth, we can attract minorities in ways that many of the other conventional Republicans could